Okay, in the first video, I introduced the genus Australopithecus, which if you remembered means southern ape, right? And the first species named was Australopithecus africanus. So Australopithecus africanus literally means southern ape from Africa. So that's where we get the name Australopithecus. So this lecture will go over two species within the genus Australopithecus, and these are the ones found in Eastern Africa. Australopithecus anamensis, the oldest one, and Australopithecus afarensis. And I should note that once you introduce a genus name, instead of writing it out every time, you can just abbreviate it with a capital first letter, so in this case A, and then a period. Okay, so the oldest and first Australopithecus anamensis. And here is a cranium. This was actually just discovered last year, so this is hot off the press. And before this specimen was discovered, we actually had no idea what Australopithecus anamensis looked like when it comes to the face. And now we know. Okay, Australopithecus anamensis dated 4 million years ago using potassium argon. No surprise there, given that this was found in Eastern Africa. So anam means lake in the local Turkana language, right? And remember, anths means from. So anamensis means it was found, well, next to a lake. So the species was found next to an ancient lake, but also a modern lake. So it was found and named from the site called Alia Bay, right on the shores of modern Lake Turkana in Kenya. It's also found at the site called Kanapoi, as well as Asa Isi in the Afar Triangle here in Ethiopia. I'll go over what the Afar Triangle is when I go over afarensis. It was found in a woodland environment, so very similar to the earliest hominins, Sahelanthropus, Auroran, and Ardipithecus. And that's what it could have looked like. Okay. So Australopithecus anamensis, obligate biped. So the earliest hominin in terms of geological age that was a definitive biped. How do we know this? Well, this is the tibia. So this is your shin bone. And we're looking at the top of it here. So this is your knee. So this is an anamensis tibia. And this is a chimpanzee tibia, right? So this is where I would ask you in class what the differences are. But since you can't answer, I will answer for you. So you could see here that you have this more of a flaring bony buttress for anamensis, whereas a chimpanzee, it just looks a lot more gracile and slender, right? And this makes sense. If you're standing on two legs, there's a lot more weight coming down on your shin bone, so you need that extra bony buttress to help support that weight. However, anamensis, the humerus, so this is the upper arm bone, this is the bottom part, so this is actually part of your elbow joint. The upper arm bone, also known as the humerus, still shows some climbing adaptations, right? And this would be primitive and ape-like. So here is that cranium, again, just discovered and published last year. Still a very small brain, 370 cubic centimeters, well within the range of modern apes today. Prognathic, primitive. And if we look at the jaw, you can probably already see where I'm going with this, right? Well, first, large canine, again, smaller than chimpanzee, but larger than a human. And there's actually still a bit of a diastema, which would be here, sorry. Yes, it would be there, with apical wear. And it has a U-shaped dental arcade. So U-shaped, cheek teeth rows parallel to each other. Okay, so that's anamensis. Now we'll go on to Australopithecus afarensis, the best known Australopith. So all kinds of cool fossils, including Lucy, there's a baby discovered, and of course the famous Laetoli footprints. So we'll go over all of these. Okay, Australopithecus afarensis is younger in age relative to anamensis and is dated to between 3.6 and 3 million years ago. So this species ranged from 3.6 all the way up until 3 million years, and of course, dated by potassium argon dating. Afar is a name for the local tribe and region where it was found. So the footprints were found in Laetoli in Tanzania. And Australopithecus afarensis has also been discovered in Ethiopia, in Hadar, site called Corsidora, and Dakika. And all these sites are located in what's known as the Afar Triangle. So if you remember, in I believe it's a previous lecture, I talked about the tectonic plates being pulled apart. So the Arabian plate going this way, the Nubian plate going this way, the Somalian plate going this way. So they're pulling apart, and the land mass in the middle just kind of sinks down. And so it's a triangle because of 3 plates pulling away. Because it sinks, it's also known as the Afar Depression, and it is one of the hottest places on Earth. Very difficult to work in. And afarensis occupied a diversity of environments, not only a woodland, like with anamensis and the earliest hominins, but you also see it in bushland where there's a lot of shrubs, grassland, something that looked like this. So this is the first hominin to move out of the woodland into a diversity of environments. So Australopithecus afarensis was first discovered in Hadar by Don Johansen, very famous paleoanthropologist. And this was the first specimen discovered. So this is the knee joint, this is that tibia again, the upper half. This is the femur, the thigh bone, the bottom half. So this is your knee joint. He actually saw the femur, and it was only this bit that was sticking up out of the ground. And it was after a long day of field work, very hot. It's kind of delirious. He was just walking around, didn't really think much of this. And so he just kicked at it. And by kicking this upper part, he revealed the lower part. And he immediately recognized that this was a hominin because it was bipedal. How would you recognize that this was bipedal? Well, you can see here that there's a bit of an angle, right? So you remember that valgus angle? So this individual had a valgus angle and thus was a biped, and thus was a hominin. Okay, and it was only the year after that he discovered this partial skeleton, very famous. Nickname is Lucy, and that's because after they discovered it, they celebrated at their camp in the field, and they listened to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds by the Beatles. Okay, so this is that skeleton, partial skeleton, and here's a reconstruction. And so Lucy lived in Ethiopia, found at the site of Hadar, which was dated to 3.2 million years ago. Okay, here's another very famous Australopithecus afarensis specimen. This is known as the Dakika baby, dated to 3.3 million years ago. So you see here we have a complete skull, right? We even have an impression of the inside of the cranium. This is known as an endocast. And so it's a negative impression of the inside of a cranium and gives us an idea of what the brain looked like and also its size. And this is a really remarkable find. You rarely find babies in the fossil record because the bones are so fragile and delicate. They usually get destroyed and not preserved like this. So this is an amazing, amazing find. And this is what the Kika baby looks like when it's reconstructed. So very happy baby with some freaky hair. So this is Lucy again. Here's another famous, more recent discovery from the site Corsidora. So this is a male Australopithecus afarensis, even more incomplete skeleton than Lucy. And so because of the partial skeleton, we know Lucy, which is a female, stood at 3'6", whereas at Corsidora, the male, is estimated to have been about between 5 feet to 5'6". So there's strong sexual dimorphism in the species, in afarensis. Okay, so let's look at some of the traits that define afarensis. So first of all, if we look at the primitive ape-like traits, afarensis had a small brain, 450 cubic centimeters. So a bit bigger than a chimpanzee, which is about 400 cubic centimeters, but still much smaller than a modern human, which is about 1,400 cubic centimeters. Second primitive ape-like trait, U-shaped dental arcade. So you can see it here, right? This is afarensis, it's a U. the cheek teeth rows are parallel to each other. You don't have that nice parabola that you see in humans. Australopithecus afarensis still had a small diastema, and it's prognathic. So its lower face juts out, just like in a chimpanzee. Derived human-like traits of the skull. The canines are smaller, much smaller than chimpanzee, smaller than anamensis' canine, but still slightly bigger than human. And there's apical wear, so no canine premolar honing. So Australopithecus afarensis exhibits mosaic evolution. So I talked about mosaic evolution when looking at all hominins in the fossil record. And if you remember, mosaic evolution is these human-like traits appearing at different times. So they don't appear all at once in one package like Darwin thought. And here is a figure which shows Australopithecus afarensis still had some primitive traits that were great for climbing, like relatively long forearm, and these other two I will talk about in the next slides. So right, it had some primitive traits, great for climbing, even though it still had a lot of traits which was indicative of it being an obligate biped, which we'll cover. Okay, so one trait that's indicative of climbing is a cranially oriented shoulder joint. So what do I mean by that? So this is the shoulder blade, the scapula. This is the right side. We're looking at it from behind. And so the joint that forms the shoulder joint is oriented upwards, right? Whereas in humans, it's oriented exactly to the side. And so you can imagine if you're climbing, right, you're hanging on a branch, you're reaching for branches, so your arm is constantly over your head. So it just helps to have a shoulder joint that is oriented in that direction. So the cranially oriented shoulder joint is indicative of climbing. Australopithecus afarensis also had long curved fingers, right? So you could see here, this is Australopithecus, this is a gorilla, both very curved, whereas humans, us, our fingers are straight. And curved fingers are great for grasping round branches. So this is indicative of an arboreal lifestyle as well. But Australopithecus afarensis also had traits indicative of bipedalism, and you really see that from the waist down. So the two that I'll cover here is Australopithecus afarensis had a wrapped ilium and a valgus angle, right? So if we look at the ilium, the hip blade, this is of a human, this is afarensis, you can see how similar they are, right, to the exclusion of the chimpanzee. And again, if you remember that wrapped ilium, the function is to reorient those gluteus minimus and medius muscles to act as hip stabilizers. And they have a valgus angle. So the femur angles inward for modern humans and Australopithecus afarensis, such that the feet are contacting the ground near the midline of the body and underneath that center of gravity. So chimpanzees do not have this, right? And again, this is the trait which Don Johanson saw when he was kicking at that femur. Another really famous site is for afarensis is that of Laetoli, Tanzania, dated 3.7 million years ago. And this site was discovered and excavated by very famous female paleoanthropologist Mary Leakey. So again, Laetoli, located in Tanzania, and these are fossil footprints. So you can see here afarensis walking along. There are some other tracks. I think these are antelope. I believe these smaller ones are a bunny. I know there are bunny footprints somewhere in there. And so this is a very unique special fossil. We rarely get fossil footprints, and it takes really special circumstances for these things to preserve. So what happened here was that a local volcano spewed ash, fell to the ground, and then it rained. So then the ash became kind of wet. And this ash was a very special one with a special chemical composition. It's known as carbonatite. What happened was when that ash mixed with the rain, it essentially formed concrete. And then so these animals were then walking across, which was essentially wet concrete. And then that layer of wet concrete had to dry up and it had to be rapidly buried before it could be destroyed by the forces of nature. So all these things had to go right in order for these fossil footprints to form and to preserve. So very much like a body fossil where a lot of things has to go right as well. So here's Mary Leakey excavating the footprints. I should also note that this discovery of these footprints is pretty fun. There's some downtime when you're in the field, and so some of the younger researchers working with her were had some downtime, were kind of bored, and so they decided to have an elephant poop fight. And so elephant poop, quite big, and when it's dried out, you can just kind of like hurl it at each other. And so one of them hurled it at another one, and they took it very seriously. So one of them dove to dodge the poop, and basically dove into this little ravine. And when he looked down, he noticed that there was a fossil footprint. So that's how they discovered the Laetoli fossil footprints, by throwing elephant poop at each other. Okay, so here are the footprints again. We can see a close-up here. So some of the derived traits, we see a short, inline, big toe, right? Although it is still slightly divergent, but very much more human-like compared to something like Ardipithecus. There's a longitudinal arch. And here we could see the two tracks. So there were at least two individuals. And so you can actually see here, kind of. So this is the left foot. This is a toe print. This is a toe print. And this is another toe print. So there were actually three individuals walking along on this track. And the second and third individual following the first was actually stepping in the footprint of the first. Why they were doing that? Not sure, but if you ever walked in deep snow, you know how difficult it is, and it's actually easier to step in someone else's footprint. Okay, this is a reconstruction when they thought it was two individuals, and this is a common one: male, bigger footprint on the right, female, smaller footprints on the left, walking arm in arm. So very romantic. Okay, so Australopithecus afarensis exhibits mosaic evolution, right? So here's a summary slide of the primitive traits and the derived traits. So most researchers think anamensis was the direct ancestor of afarensis. So anamensis, over time, through natural selection, gradually evolved into afarensis. And that's because they're very similar morphology, but afarensis is slightly more derived. So smaller canines, its lower premolar is more bicuspid. The two cusps are more equal in size, whereas in anamensis, one of them is much larger and dominates, which is more similar to the unicuspid premolar morphology of chimpanzees. But yeah, so most researchers agree that anamensis directly evolved into afarensis. So Australopithecus is also interesting because it's associated with some cut marks. So this is at the Kika site where the baby was found. And there are these kind of gouges on a fossil, a rib of a buffalo-sized mammal, that is believed to have been left by an afarensis hominin using a stone tool and cutting off meat and accidentally scoring the bone. However, this is kind of controversial because crocodiles, they have this sharp ridge on their teeth, and when they bite bone, they can actually also sometimes leave these scores that can mimic cut marks. So this is a huge debate in our field right now, whether the Kika cut marks were actually made by hominins and stone tools, or they were just made by crocodile tooth marks. So there's actually a faculty member in our department, Michael Ponte, who's very much interested in this question, and that's what he researches. Also found are stone tools, dated 3.3 million years ago in Kenya. So on the west side of that Lake Turkana, that modern lake where anamensis was found. And you could see here, they don't really look like much to the untrained eye, but there are certain features that are indicative of hominins taking these stones, bashing them together to produce sharp flakes. And so this is how they make those stone tools. So they basically take a rock known as a hammerstone, they knock it against another rock called a core, and you have to knock it in a very special particular way to knock off what is known as a flake. And this flake has a very sharp edge and can basically be used as a knife. So you can do something like this, butcher an animal. And yeah, this is a good illustration of how sharp these things are, because this is an elephant, which has very tough, thick skin, very comparable to like a car tire. Okay, so that ends our second video. We went over the two Australopithecus species found in East Africa. Now we'll go over the Australopithecus species found in South Africa, Australopithecus africanus.